Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Mr. Rader. This is a lesson for AP World History. We're looking at Unit 7, the DBQ that has been posted to AP Classroom. And this is looking at global conflicts in the 20th century. Okay, so if we look at the document on the screen, we want to evaluate the extent to which nations or groups use the memory of the First World War to advance their political objectives in the period 1918 to 1939. So we have to first consider who are the players in this interwar period. What were their personal motivations for engaging in interventionist or isolationist policies following the conclusion of the First World War? So, some of the major parties that you should be aware of from your studies of US and global history in the 10th and 11th grade would be Germany, the United States, Austria, Hungary, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, China, and Japan. Some of the countries you may not be as familiar with, but they did play a very large role in the First World War, would be an empire, which is now modern day Turkey. We'd be looking at Australia, New Zealand, and India as participants in British colonial troops in different campaigns, along with South Africa as another major participant in this conflict. Some additional players that we may not necessarily consider could include, among others, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, and really looking at the connection between the countries that were given a seat at the table at the conclusion of the First World War with the Versailles Treaty and those that were not. So, with the new version of the AP exam for this year only, it will be 5 documents for the DBQ, and you'll have 45 minutes. Now, the one that they published to AP Classroom is the standard DBQ, so it's a little more than 5 documents. And I'm going to recommend that you take 60 minutes to work on this. I'm giving you a couple of days to do it, but please don't spend much more than 60 minutes on that assignment. So what I'm going to do in terms of today's lesson, I'm going to split into 2 parts. The first part, we're going to look at the documents themselves. And then the second part, I'm going to give a 5 to 10 minute overview lecture on some of the key moments and transitions that were happening in the interwar period. Okay, so in terms of this document, they want to first see that you can come up with an historically defensible thesis that establishes a line of reason. So what you would want to consider is, how did each nation use the results, the consequences, the resolutions of the First World War to advance their own political objectives? So, for example, the United States became more isolationist. They turned inward. They did not want to get involved in European conflicts. By contrast, the British and the French imposed very harsh conditions on Germany with the Treaty of Versailles, which really prompted German resentment and led to the collapse of the Weimar Republic in the 1930s and the rise of Adolf Hitler to the chancellorship of Germany March 1st, 1933. Okay, so they want to look at a broader historical context. So this is where you want to be able to discuss things such as the Versailles Treaty. You'd want to look at the direct consequences of that treaty, the fact that Germany had to give up all of its colonies. They had to pay war indemnities to the French. You would want to look at the rapid industrialization of the Rhine Valley that the Germans did in the 1930s. Support an argument in response to the problem using all but one of the documents. So this is what we call evidence. So you'd want to be bringing in specific facts, examples, and details, whether they be quotes or paraphrasing information from the documents themselves as you write the essay. And this would be, again, to support the argument. So this means EVA. EVA means evidence with analysis. So you can get a point just for using the evidence, but to get the second point, you have to explain how that evidence supports the thesis that you are trying to make. Okay, the next bullet point uses at least one additional piece of specific historical evidence beyond that found in the documents. So this is what we have been talking about all year. This is EBD. This is evidence beyond the documents. So it's not just giving the general context, but for example, and I'll do it with one of the documents just to kind of show you that process, it goes beyond general context. For at least 3 of the documents, explain how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and their audience is relevant. Okay, So this is sourcing. This is what we've been doing all year. This is HIPPO, your historical context, your intended audience, the purpose, the point of view, and the outside information that you yourselves can bring to the documents. This is your opportunity to explain how, for example, the bias of the writer manifests itself within the document. Let's say you're looking at a speech from a government official. Well, how did that person's position in society influence how they saw the events unfolding around them? And the last bullet point, this is the complexity point. It is the hardest one to get. And it's basically thinking about corroboration, qualifying or modifying arguments. And this is where you get to that deeper level of analysis, which is when you go beyond what the documents can say to really get at the heart of the task in front of us. Okay, so the first document, the source is the tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, London. Okay. So it's a picture, and in the picture it says the tomb of the unknown warrior is located in the most prominent place in Westminster Abbey, directly in front of the main entrance. So here's just some basic examples that we could bring into this. So Westminster Abbey is one of the most famous cathedrals in England, in London, and it would be a place that a lot of people go to even today and would be able to see this. So it's located in a prominent place. Tomb of the unknown warrior could signify that this is a memorial to soldiers who were not found, soldiers who were not given proper burials. And you can see it in the text here as well. It says of a warrior brought from France to lie among the most illustrious of the land and buried here on Armistice Day, November 1920, in the presence of His Majesty King George V, his ministers of state, the chiefs of his forces, and then they basically speak to information related to the Christian nature of the British government. So that would be the first document. And again, the source is it's an artifact, and it's in a church, and we can think about its purpose in terms of how do we honor the dead? We create a memorial. There's a connection here between religion and state-based functions in terms of historical memory. Okay, document 2. This is from Mohandas Gandhi, who is the Indian independence leader. Statement at his trial for sedition. Sedition is very similar to treason. In Ahmedabad, India, March 1922. So when you read through this document, Gandhi is speaking about the Boer War between the Dutch and the British, 1899. He's talking about how he volunteered, he raised a volunteer ambulance corps, etc. But again, think about it. If we look at it, what's happening? Well, he's been brought up on trials for sedition. All right, so this is his defense. So if we're thinking about purpose, we want to think about the things that Gandhi is doing to try to signify how he is supporting the British Empire. So you'll read through the document here. He speaks to what was happening in the war, the conference in Delhi, 1918, for the Indian recruits. Remember, as I said before, Indian soldiers fought on behalf of the British. He's saying that his hope was shattered. He saw the British reforms in India was only a method of further robbing India for wealth. So again, we can see here, this is one form of memory. The memory here is that the colonial soldiers who fought for the British believed that they might have had an opportunity for independence and the British did not give it to them. So this is another way of thinking about point of view in the document here. Clearly, Gandhi is upset and frustrated with the consequences of the war and how the British were not helping them. Okay. Document 3, this is from the German leader Adolf Hitler. This is in 1922, so this is 11 years before he comes to power. That's important. Understanding that can allow us to figure out, okay, so this is happening 4 years after the war has ended. So Germany is in their Weimar Republic. Hitler does not have any power yet, but he is leading this party, the Nazi party in Bavaria. And he is, again, kind of setting the foundation for his right-wing militaristic government. The economy is of secondary importance. World history teaches us that no people become great through economic success alone. So this is, again, setting the foundation for what his view are going to be. Notice this idea, the memory of the First World War. A nation that loses its honor becomes politically defenseless and then becomes enslaved also in the economic sphere. With that in mind, we must call to account the criminals of November 1918. Notice his word choice. This is very important in terms of understanding the bias of this particular document, okay? looking at how they're dishonoring the nation. So they want to be very, very clear here. In this case, Hitler is using anti-Semitism to really scapegoat a group of people to blame for the German military failure at the end of the First World War. All right, so this is very, very important because he's getting to the heart of how the Germans are going to use the conclusion of the First World War to really influence their politics, really specifically looking at, once Hitler comes to power, the changing of the German state, using fascism, extreme nationalism, jingoism to essentially say that the Germans have a right to expand their territory, to conquer subject peoples. And it helps him to justify, as inhumane as it was, his vision for what he thought would make a better Germany. And it's important because the prompt specifically asks us to look at how groups use the memory of the First World to advance their own objectives. So that's what Hitler's doing in this document. So here's a good example of EBD, evidence beyond the documents. 1935, the Germans passed what's called the Nuremberg Laws. And the Nuremberg Laws was one of the major attempts to essentially isolate the Jewish people. It's one of the 10 stages of genocide, to shut down their businesses, to make it very difficult for them to be able to be integrated within the larger German society. And that is something to keep in mind when we look at evidence beyond the documents. You could also look at Kristallnacht, which was the Night of Broken Glass, when essentially the police forces turned a blind eye to vandalism, to riots, to burning of buildings, and very other tragic events. Okay, document 4. This says it's the political platform of the Communist International, a Soviet-sponsored organization of communist parties based in Moscow. So again, think about the purpose of a political party, how they could use evidence from the First World War. Document 5, this is from an Australian pastor. Okay, so now we're looking at a religious official. The Anzac were the name of the troops that dealt with the First World War. And it's explaining information as an article published in Labour Daily, the newspaper of their leftist Labour Party. Okay, so some of the things we could bring in terms of just general context when we think about many of these Labour parties, middle of the 20th century, many of them are socialist in their ideology. Not necessarily communist, but closer to communism than looking on the other end of the spectrum, fascism or conservative democracies. Notice this quote here. Anzac Day, to be rightly spent, should be spent as a day of national contrition. We should make an imaginative pilgrimage to the graves of our Anzacs, the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, and pledge ourselves over their cold ashes to the cause of universal peace. So again, it's marshaling the memory of the First World War for a very, very clear objective, right? Is looking at how the war should be remembered within the cultural norms and values of the Australian people. Okay, document 6. This is Shukru Kaya, the Interior Minister of Turkey. Again, notice the year 1931. The Ottoman Empire was disbanded by 1923. Kemal Ataturk comes to power, and they create the Republic of Turkey. Now, again, notice they mention Ataturk in this document, so mentioning his name would not be EBD. It would not be evidence beyond the documents. However, you could speak to what was happening in Turkey. What was their modernizations that were taking place in the 1920s and 30s? Why did they bring in Western ideas, Western dress, Western values in many ways? Okay. Notice again here, they're making it very clear in terms of how they want to remember the people that fought, heroes who died defending the fatherland. All right. And document 7 speaks to a British writer and a social worker. Again, consider what the bias of a social worker might be as you put together your response. Okay, so in terms of the online class, I'm just going to go over a few of the things that you could earn. I'm going to show you how to earn the point for the thesis. So you must respond to the prompt with an historically defensible thesis that establishes a line of reasoning. So some examples the College Board accepts. Many political leaders used the memory of the First World War to support their political objectives of boosting nationalism and fostering a sense of unity. So those are your two reasons, nationalism and a sense of unity. So it says includes a claim, introduces a line of reasoning, in value how nations and groups use the memory to advance their political objectives. And then the other example they give is although many nations use the memory of the First World War to advance their political objectives, like increasing patriotism, some groups used it to challenge the political status quo. So that thesis might be really useful if you were to look at the document from Mahatma Gandhi, if you were to look at the document from Adolf Hitler, or if you were to bring in some outside information. So again, good context could speak to Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese struggle for independence. So that could be another way, another entry point for you to address that particular document. For context, they offer a lot of acceptable answers: imperialist competition in Africa and Asia, suffragist movements in Europe and North America, fascism and communism as ideologies, and some of the empires that began to collapse. So, for example, Tanzania in East Africa was German controlled, and then it was taken over by the Allied powers. Okay, so this breaks down how to use evidence of the documents. And I'm going to take a quick look at EBD so you can see what they would have accepted. So some examples that they speak about, specific battles that took place, such as the Battle of the Somme, Verdun. I mentioned this in the lecture before, specific terms of the Treaty of Versailles, so the idea of reparations, taking away their colonies, so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of this, and what I'm going to open up next on this screen, this was one of the review sessions I gave 2 years ago for Saturday tutoring. So if you would like to continue to watch the content part of this video, by all means, please continue to watch. If all you needed was the brief introduction to the DBQ, at this point, you can begin working on that. So in front of you is the review, the fourth review session I gave in that year. And you'll notice that the AP exam, the older version, was broken into 6 periods. So our new version is broken into 9 periods, and it's a condensed time frame. So this focus here, I'm going to look at the documents that speak specifically to 1900 to the present, as that is what's most relevant for the materials that you're looking at now. So I'm going to scroll through these slides and get to the 1900s. If any of you would like access to these documents, I can send them to you. Just let me know. Okay, so now we're in the 20th century. So one of the things that historians look at is periodization. You'll notice there it says why 1914. Again, that was the old periodization for the AP exam. And again, they were looking at it really from the outbreak of the First World War. The new curriculum looks at global conflicts in 1900. So specifically, we could look at some bigger events. We could look at the Boxer Rebellion in China. We could look at the Boer War in South Africa. We can look at different conflicts as they existed in the world in 1900. We could look at the conflicts between the Russians and the Japanese in 1904. We can look at the conflicts that were existing between the Ottomans and the Greeks. There's many different ways you can look at it. But some major themes to consider: the decline of empires is really big in the 20th century. Decolonization, which is going to be Unit 8, which is the Cold War and decolonization, is big in this time. Social reforms, globalization, and environmental issues. Okay, so Treaty of Versailles, a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. Lasting peace for about 20 years. The war ends 1918. Treaty is signed the following year. The war breaks out again September 1st, 1939, with the Second World War. It creates a League of Nations. It is the precursor to the United Nations. Unfortunately, the United States, which at the time was becoming one of the most powerful countries by the turn of the 20th century, we were the #1 steel producer. And we were #2 right behind Germany in some of our major weapons capabilities. But here are the problems, and this is where we don't really see resolution of the conflicts. The Treaty of Versailles had a war guilt clause, which again, if you're going to make one party accept full responsibility for the war, it's going to lead to lasting resentment, and that's really kind of where the problem is. The Alsace-Lorraine territory was taken away from the Germans and given back to the French. So I'll give you a story, just a quick sidebar here, and it really does explain kind of the long-lasting issues between the Germans and the French. So in 1870, Prussia, as the leading German power, engages in a series of military campaigns to unite the 360 provinces of Germany under one king. So in that campaign, they go to war with France. It's called the Franco-Prussian War. It lasts from again, top of my head, I think it's like 1866, 1867 to 1871. That's not something you need to know for AP Worlds. It's a big part of the AP European history curriculum, but it helps to kind of set the foundation here. So at the end of the war, they sign a peace treaty in an old-fashioned train car. Okay, uh, at the end of the First World War, the French roll in the same exact train car. Really, it's just as a way to humiliate the Germans. They make them sit down, they make them sign an armistice to stop fighting. 1941, after Hitler invades France, he invades, occupies Paris June 1940. They pull out the same exact train car, the Germans now, and they make the French sign their defeat in that same car. It's just little side anecdotes like that. They really kind of illustrate the need for actual conflict resolution. And when these things don't happen, the lasting consequences of this. So these are some of the key details to kind of keep in mind. Also, they banned the Germans from joining the League of Nations. So by banning the enemy, it makes it impossible for them to resolve conflicts, because how are you going to resolve a conflict if the two parties in the conflict can't actually meet to discuss out what the issues are? Okay, so here's some acts of aggression that led directly to the Second World War. So if we're looking at Japan, in the early 1930s, they attacked Manchuria, northern China. They renamed the territory Manchukuo, and essentially they do it because they need natural resources. And what do the League of Nations do? Well, they condemn the action. They say, very bad, Japan. You shouldn't do that now. But did they send in any? Was there any military response? No. It's one of the issues that the United Nations now tends to be criticized for when there's larger conflicts, that they'll have resolutions. They'll even have binding resolutions in the Security Council, but when push comes to shove, they won't send in troops because two or three members of the Security Council will use their veto power. It's usually either America and Great Britain versus China and Russia, or some combination therein. All right. In Italy, if you remember, before we went remote, we talked about the Battle of Adwa. 1896, the very first time that any African country defeats a European power on their own soil. So the Ethiopians bought Gatling guns, machine guns from the British, and they used them against the Italians very successfully, and they defeated them. Now, when Benito Mussolini comes to power in 1922, one of the first things that he wants to do is reclaim the glory of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire of Caesar, of Augustus, of Octavianus, um, of Mark Antony, like all these major leaders. And in order to do that, they need to restore their glory. They need to first attack a country where they feel they can win using their industrialized military capabilities. Why do they do it? Well, it distracted them from the economic depression that was hitting in the 1920s. And you may have learned U.S. history, the Great Depression, 1929. Yes, in the United States, but the decade after the World War in Europe was relatively weak throughout the continent. And again, what was the reaction? League of Nations, they did nothing. This is one of those memories of the First World War. European powers, the American powers, they did not want to get involved. Isolationism really became a major thing at the time. They have their own problems to deal with. Okay, and the Germans, we have three different key events. So there is the annexation of Austria in 1938, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, 1938. This is looking at what Hitler called Lebensraum, or living space. They wanted to produce more living space for the German people. And then Poland. 1939, September 1st, this is going to be the match, the powder keg, whatever you want to call it. This is going to be the event that's going to begin the Second World War. The reasons are clearly laid out, and you can see how the Allies reacted. The primary thing that they did was appeasement. Appeasement did not work. A good example to kind of help you kind of think about it, think of a child in a grocery store. Okay, so the child wants a chocolate bar. So the child asks their parent, "Mommy, Daddy, can I have a chocolate bar?" And they say no. Child throws a temper tantrum. So the parent has a couple of choices. So the parent can discipline the child in the store. The parent can ignore the child. Or the parent can buy the child a chocolate bar to quiet them down. So appeasement would be the example of buying the candy bar. It appeases the aggressor. and in theory makes them less likely to continue doing that kind of behavior. But just for those of you that have younger siblings, or maybe even remember back to your childhoods, may remember, it usually doesn't work. Usually it's going to just encourage the bad behavior. Okay, so this is an example of this. When they signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, Chamberlain, says, "My good friends, I've returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Go home and get a nice, quiet sleep." Well, 1 year later, they end up going to war, and it's the Second World War. Winston Churchill, very famous, said at the time, "An appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last." Just think about those words. Like, that really does say something when looking at uh, how different people viewed the situation in the interwar period. Okay, so when we think about the Second World War, if we look at the map here, this is the area of the maximum Axis expansion through September 1942. These were neutral countries, Switzerland. And this is kind of a view of looking at a map of combat. So the countries in green, these are countries that are essentially not directly a part of the Axis powers. Maybe they were neutrals. For example, Spain stays neutral. There's the Spanish Civil War. Francisco Franco, he actually in many ways supports fascism. In many ways, he was a fascist-based right-wing leader himself, but he doesn't directly get involved in the war. Same is true with the Portuguese. Okay, so this is the area of Europe that the Germans take over. And you'll notice they have two campaigns, an Eastern campaign and a Western campaign. And similar to the First World War, the Germans are going to overextend themselves in the Second World War by trying to fight two fronts at the same time, and they're going to try to invade Russia twice. June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, they invade the Soviet Union. And in many ways, just like in the First World War, they were overconfident. They thought their blitzkrieg would work by attacking the land with the tanks, by the air with the German Luftwaffe and bombers, and by the sea with the German Navy really taking advantage of the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean getting into the Mediterranean. It backfires on them, and the Germans will eventually lose. Now, the Americans, when we think about our contributions in the Second World War, we think of D-Day. Now, D-Day is towards the very end of the war. It's June 6, 1944, less than a year before the war actually ends. The war ends May 7th, 1945. And we land on Normandy, right? From Great Britain, we land on the shores of Normandy. But notice this whole area here, North Africa. The Americans are actually fighting in North Africa in 1942. They're fighting Rommel. They're fighting on the deserts of North Africa. Okay. So here are some major turning points in terms of things that were happening. Mentioned Operation Overlord, D-Day, the invasion of Italy and Sicily in 1943, El Alamein, which is really based in Egypt, and Operation Torch when we land on the shores of Morocco. Okay, so after the Second World War, the Americans occupied Japan. This is an image looking at the U.S. command and how they're going to deal with Japan. So they disband their armed forces. They force the Japanese to sign a new constitution. It creates a constitutional monarchy. The Americans knew that they had to leave the emperor in power. If they were to try to take Hirohito out of power, it would have led to even larger full-scale rebellion in Japan, and the Americans did not want that. The Japanese accepted the constitution. They knew that the treaty would take away their overseas empire. By 1952, the Allied occupation officially ends. Okay, so what is the impact of the Second World War? So there's a lot of things to consider. So going into the world, so as a periodization, before the world, what are some big themes? Okay, imperialism, colonialism. This is essentially the idea the British had an empire where the sun never set because literally they had empires in every time zone. The Great Depression, capitalism, fascism and communism, mass production of weapons, the beginnings, the development of, for example, the V-2 rocket. The Germans were very big on that in the Second World War. Had they been able to bring them into full-scale production, it might have made the war very different in terms of its outcome. The Americans are unable to test their first nuclear weapons until August, after the Germans had already surrendered. So some of the technology in the V-2 rockets actually are a big part of jets, airplanes today. When you look at jets, they don't have propellers. They are based on essentially jet fuel. Okay, so what's happening in the war itself? So, some very clear things. The imperial powers are severely weakened. This war has a major toll on the West. Cost of the wars, the atrocities that were taking place in Europe, in Asia, in Japan, decolonization, the idea of the creation of a third world, what we would now call the developing world today, developing countries, looking at new countries being formed in Asia and in Africa. The Cold War mindset, the US and the Soviet Union turning into superpowers, the campaigns for democracy versus communism, looking at the Warsaw Pact from the Soviet Union versus the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, for the West, the creation of the United Nations, peace talks, Declaration of Human Rights, the let's call it the United Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR. Okay. And just some things to kind of keep in mind, and I'm going to end the lecture here. There's a lot more to this PowerPoint, but I want to try to keep it relatively short for the purposes of that DBQ. But just some things to keep in mind. This is a formula for 20th century revolutions. We see the changes of traditional rural societies undergoing rapid industrialization and urbanization, the creation of major city centers. A corrupt, stubborn, and unresponsive political system. We see this in China. We see this in Russia. We see this in many cases in Germany. It allowed for the Nazi Party to actually rise in the first place. We see it in Italy. We even see it in the United States. So if you look at like 1929, 1930, 1931, the administration of Herbert Hoover is not doing a whole lot to really fight back against the Great Depression. When FDR comes into power, 1933, in his first 100 days, he signs the New Deal. The New Deal ushers in the largest infrastructure project in the United States history. In many cases, the $2 trillion package that was recently passed to fight coronavirus is building on the legacy of FDR in terms of really taking an intervention stand in the American economy. Okay, so we spoke about the Mexican Revolution. That is another document. That is another particular movement that speaks to different events. And there's a lot more to this document, as you can see as I'm scrolling through on the left-hand side. We'll talk a lot about some of this stuff when we look at the Cold War and we look at what was happening in regions of Africa and regions of Asia. All right, everybody, I hope you have a nice day, a nice weekend, and I hope that you found this lecture to be informative and useful, that it will help you with writing this DBQ essay. I remain available if any of you have any questions or concerns. All right, everybody, have a great day and a great weekend. Bye.